everyone. My name is John Petrowski, and I am the Regional Sales Director for MetricStream in Boston, Massachusetts. And on the way down, flying down here last night, I was trying to think of maybe just a brief quote to open things here with the panel, something that maybe encapsulates the spirit of Miami. So one of my favorite celebrity personalities, if you will, is Anthony Bourdain. So I just wanted to share a quick quote from Anthony Bourdain, which I think really captures the spirit of the city. So he said the following: "Is Miami America? Is it a state? Is it the South? I love Miami for the same reason I love the places that I love most around the world. It's the mix here, the big, messy, dysfunctional broth of people from all over the world that make it so awesome and make it a place I want to keep coming back to year after year. And so I'd love to keep coming back here year after year and be with our partners and customers. And thank you so much. And I hope we continue this tradition for a long time, whether it's Miami or elsewhere. Thank you so much for your business and your participation." So without further delay, I would like to introduce our distinguished panel. It's a very diverse panel, and we're very fortunate to have them here today. If I'm going to introduce everyone just down the row, and then I'll ask you to hold the applause for after I introduce everyone, and then we'll give them a nice welcome. So let's begin. So first to my left is Ramzi Kazem. Ramzi Kazem is a certified compliance and ethics professional and an accomplished attorney. As Regional Compliance Officer, North America for Andritz, Ramzi has a broad range of responsibilities, including preparing risk assessments, implementing program improvements, investigations of claims of misconduct, and managing third-party risk. His expertise includes designing, assessing, and implementing compliance programs using a risk-based approach, which will be very relevant for our discussion today. Thank you so much, Ramzi. Next, we have Emma Lomax. Dr. Emma Lomax is a passionate ethics and compliance professional who is intrigued by the role of integrity in the context of corporate social responsibility. She is the VP Associate General Counsel of Compliance at Zendesk, an excellent leader in customer service software, where she leads the global integrity and compliance function. Prior to moving in-house, Emma served for just over a decade prosecuting financial fraud and corruption with the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. Welcome. Thank you for your participation. Next, we have Maxim Sultanov.
Right.
All right. I believe I did that correctly. From Nornickel, also correct?
Great.
Wonderful. I also saw it as Norilsk Nickel.
Yeah, it's different.
Oh,
Short name.
okay.
Maxim and Max, you know.
Wonderful. I'll choose the truncated one from now on. Max possesses extensive professional experience in the mining, metallurgy, and cement production sectors. Throughout his career, he has held significant roles in leading manufacturing companies, focusing on industrial marketing, ESG compliance, and due diligence, sustainable development, and responsible sourcing. Max spearheaded the development of the first due diligence management system, which included the formulation of a supplier code of conduct and responsible sourcing policy. Welcome, Max.
Thank you, John.
Of course. And then finally, Nick Malhotra is joining us from Royal Caribbean Group. Nick is the AVP Global Compliance and Ethics Director for Royal Caribbean Group, which consists of 3 global cruise brands: Royal Caribbean International, Celebrity Cruises, and Silversea Cruises. The company's 64 ships carry millions of guests a year to more than 1,000 ports on all 7 continents. And I'm happy to say that my family and I are definitely have been to a few of them. It's a great experience. Nick started his career as an attorney with Arnold and Porter in Washington, D.C., where he specialized in complex litigation, product liability law, and corporate governance. Let's have a nice hand for him. So, we've just got a handful of questions here, and we'll kind of do a round robin format where we go down the line because you all have such diverse backgrounds. I think it would be really valuable to get all of your insights to each of the questions. The first one is going to be very broad and encompassing, so take as much time as you need to define the tenets of your program and what your philosophy and approach is. So, number one, what does risk-based compliance mean, and why is it important for organizations today? How does it differ from other traditional compliance approaches? We'll start with you, Ramsey.
Okay, well, John, thank you for the introduction, and
Sure.
good afternoon, everybody. Really excited to be on the panel with you guys, and look forward to hearing your perspective on things. To me, a risk-based approach to compliance is applying a framework that identifies your organization's highest risks and then deploys your compliance resources in such a manner that targets those highest risks first and then works its way down the line to your lower tiered risks. And the benefit of a risk-based approach to compliance there are many. But first and foremost, in my opinion, it's a much more efficient and an effective way of using your compliance resources. I have never met a compliance professional who complained to me about having too many resources, right? We all are limited, we all have our budgets, and we all are able to only do so much with the resources that we have. But by taking a risk-based approach and targeting your highest risks first, you're actually getting more bang for your compliance buck in terms of lowering your overall compliance risk for the organization. A second benefit of using a risk-based approach is that in going through the exercise of identifying your compliance risk areas and going through the exercise of risk ranking them and evaluating them, you're actually building and developing your compliance program around your business instead of around some one-size-fits-all standard or a regulatory framework that might be overly broad in its requirements or far too narrow to capture all of your compliance risks. I'll give you one quick, simple example. Years ago, when I was in my consulting life, we were brought into a client that asked us to come in and evaluate their compliance program. And when I looked at their compliance training, I realized that the same suite of compliance modules were being deployed to all of the employees across the company. Same training all the way across. And when I asked them why did they do that, they explained to me, they said, well, Section 8 of the sentencing guidelines says that one of the fundamental elements of a compliance program is to have employee compliance training. Well, that's true, but what they didn't realize is that by the approach that they adopted, they were actually adopting a lose-lose approach. Because on the one hand, you're giving training to employees on topics that have no relevance to their function or role within the company. And then on the other hand, there were people within that organization who needed specialized, specific training, yet you were providing them a high-level, generic, overview type training of the given topics. So a risk-based approach, if they had used a risk-based approach, they would have identified the high-risk transactions, the high-risk projects, the high-risk functions, the high-risk personnel. And through that, you could identify the personnel who would need specialized training. You would identify the personnel who would need just a general knowledge, and you would identify the people who didn't need training on that topic at all. By taking that kind of approach, it's a much more effective and efficient way of using your resources, and it is tailored to your business. And then finally, one of the benefits of using a risk-based approach is that the enforcement agencies expect us to do that. They want us to be able to demonstrate that we were thoughtful and that we thought through all of our compliance risk as we were developing and implementing our program. And so a risk-based program forces you to do that. It forces you to be thoughtful, and it allows you to be proactive and targeted and strategic in developing your risk mitigation controls and your risk mitigation tools. And so for those reasons, a risk-based approach is, in my opinion, better than the traditional approach because it's a more effective use of your resources, it's tailored to your business, and it gives you the flexibility to be strategic and targeted in your risk management and risk mitigation.
Thank you, Ramsey. Very insightful. Emma?
Gosh, Ramsey, we can all go home now. I think you've covered it.
Those are all my points too.
So +1 to everything he said, for sure. I'll underscore a couple of things you said, and I'll add a little bit. So, I worked at the SEC for just over a decade prosecuting these, and I couldn't agree more with a lot of what you said. I mean, I don't know how we're going to define the traditional approach. There are many. as compared to a risk-based approach. One is a checkbox approach. You indicated the other one, which is just taking a regulatory area and trying to cover all the risks and maybe training on what I as an anti-corruption expert know rather than what the business actually needs to know. So I'd like to just really talk about making risk relevant or doing relevant risk work. Because there's a difference there. I think we do spend, those of us that are a little bit enlightened, we spend time thinking, well, how do we make risk relevant to the business? How will we get that into their hearts and minds? How will we engage with them? I want to switch it around a little bit because, again, if you take making risk relevant, you still have to figure out what risks you are going to make relevant. And I think it should be the other way around. We should figure out what the risks are that are relevant first. And so the other thing that the regulators really encourage us to do is risk assessment. Again, no surprise to anyone in this room. But a risk-based approach is making sure that your risk assessment is effective enough for you to identify what risks are relevant to your business. And then you can do the great work of making risk relevant. So one of the ways we try to do that at Zendesk, I've also been at Disney and Snapchat, very different businesses, as you said, there's no one size fits all. But it's for us to really, again, it sounds simple, but get to know the business. What are they doing and what are they planning to do and what risks are around the corner for them? And so we try to adopt the objective-centered risk approach. Again, you may have heard about this, many people are writing and talking and studying this. And really, it's, again, very simple. What you're thinking about there is what are the objectives and goals of the business today? What have they been doing? What do they want? What are they doing today? And what do they want to do? And really study those OKRs that the business are putting into place and start talking in their language. You don't want to impose on them PowerPoints, annual training on law and numbers of lawyers. Actually, you want to talk about the activities that they are involved in and what vulnerabilities specifically do those activities expose them and the company to. And I found that to be really, really powerful in terms of a risk-based approach because all of a sudden you're speaking in the language of your business. You are having them recognize that when they consider a business opportunity, they should be considering the risk that goes with that opportunity. And then there is no opportunity without considering and mitigating those risks. All of a sudden, they become risk owners. They understand that they are the risk owners. They understand that we as the compliance professionals are helping facilitate good decision-making on a daily basis. And I say daily basis, because I think we talked about continuous risk assessment earlier. You don't want your risk assessment to be an annual thing or a biannual thing. You really want your business team members all along the way, from the management all the way down, to be thinking about risk every time they're considering an opportunity, and to doing that cycle of risk identification, risk assessment, risk mitigation on a constant decision-making basis. And so I think a risk-based approach is that. Not just the risks that we decide are relevant, but actually making risk relevant in a way that's genuine because it focuses on what they are planning to do. The alternative, again, I don't know if it's traditional, is that we're in a silo in our ivory tower and we're irrelevant and we're that kind of checkbox thing that we have to do once or twice a year, and the business just goes on without thinking about risk, thinking of it as a nuisance. And so I think of a risk-based approach as making it pervasive, making it part of everyday decision-making, and making sure then those other boxes us risk professionals like to tick. Who's a risk owner? Who's going to mitigate it? Who's going to look at the controls and test their effectiveness? You actually engage the business on those because it's so relevant to the money they're trying to make. And I'll just pause on that because let's face it, as much as we all think we're out there to be ethical, which we are, we're also out there to make money, right? Profit is on their mind. And so again, in terms of talking in their language, I like to say about the value proposition of risk management and actually that it's value creation. And if you don't know how to consider risk with opportunity, you might leave some money on the table. You might decide that things are more risky than they are and not go into that. I've got plenty of examples, I won't take too much time, but I've been able to show my business partners how they can unlock opportunities if they are willing to consider risk from the outset.
Excellent. So Ramsey's earlier comment, this is what the regulators expect from us. You would agree with that from your SEC experience?
100% the regulators expect us to be looking at our risks, our business. Again, I was there for 10 years, but I couldn't possibly know what was going on inside of all the companies I investigated. We expected the companies to show that they had done a tailored risk assessment and they were focusing on the things that were highest risk in their industry, in their region, in their business, and the specific goals that they had as a company. So all the way down to the goals level, not just, oh, you're tech, boom, right? Because all tech is not the same, as you can imagine. I just want to make a point about that. Don't focus too heavily, I'm going to say this is quite irreverent, on what the DOJ and the SEC are talking about today. I mean, they're going to go out doing speeches and they're going to tell you that they care about bring your own device or compensation clawbacks. And that's because they've been dealing with that recently, right? It doesn't mean that it's the highest risk on your table. And I've, again, seen a lot of companies, a lot of my peers running, like I will say, it's like a dog and a squirrel. It's like, oh, look,
Yes.
let's focus on what the DOJ has talked about last week. But it rises to the top of the risk register. Why? Because the DOJ is talking about it. Of course, what's enforced is one data point that you should consider, but it certainly shouldn't be the navigator for your program.
I understand. Very insightful. Thank you. Max?
Okay, agree with Ramses Hammer. But before I give my comments, I would like to ask how many of you leverage GRC framework?
Show of hands.
Please raise your hands. Okay. How many of you leverage GRC framework aligned with ESG framework?
Actively aligning to
No.
ESG.
That's why I'm asking. Just check. You can see it from my back. This is ESG GRC solution. That's interesting point because before I came to this event, I thought that's it's very important to make a difference between just compliance, GRC compliance, and ESG to be implemented into compliance. What's the point? You can spend a lot of resources to risk mitigations, but for mining sector, for instance, it's very important not mandatory regulations to be in compliance with. It's for sure, but more risky to be in compliant with indigenous people expectations, with environmental regulations which are not mandatory but just like expectations, which are labor practices because it's very important to source materials responsibly. So my point, what the difference, of course you can spend a lot of money for that, but it's more critical, more crucial to have a holistic approach, to have some kind of cooperation with your stakeholders, not only clients, but also investors' expectations, also other partnership within the whole supply chain. For instance, how many of you have EV cars? Just hybrid, okay. So just for your understanding, EV cars has the battery. Battery includes nickel, and any automotive companies requires to source nickel responsibly. So that's the point. That's maybe because of the time.
No, very helpful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This is a really important discussion, so thanks for having it. Unfortunately, it's right before lunch, so we'll try to speed it up. But I think that the points that my colleagues have talked about, we have limited resources, and in compliance, I think we're in a unique position as compliance professionals to see the full landscape of risks that are facing the company, and how to strategize and how to mitigate the biggest risks is specific to your organization. The panel here isn't going to be able to say this is how you must do it. How you interpret regulatory decisions, how you interpret, how you look at the training and communication landscape, how you look at your supply chain will be company specific. But I think one of the things that we all agree on is that it is important, and the regulators, including the OECD most recently with respect to human rights, I've talked about the importance of looking at the higher risks and the higher issues that might be facing your organization. The DOJ certainly said that as well. I think it wasn't in the most recent publication, but the one before that. They talked about a compliance program which doesn't focus on the key risks is not effective. It is an effective program if you're actually showing you're mitigating the key risks. And then the question is, well, how do you do that? And there's a couple of different ways to do it. The traditional approach, which can work, although I don't think it's always the best approach, is to have your zone of experts. So, your traditional enterprise risk management, you have your 20 experts across the various compliance and governance fields. They come up with 1,000 risks every year.
They put it into a register, and they continue to do that every single year. I'm not sure today how effective that is. I think it was what people did, what companies did maybe a decade ago, but I think you're seeing a shift, or I'm seeing a shift towards project-based risk assessment. So you're looking at, if somebody were to ask you, what are the 5 or 6 biggest projects that your company's working on, are you able to answer that question? Do you have visibility into that question? Are you involved in those projects? And if you're able to then look at those projects from the lens of the experts, so you've got the prism, and you start to understand what the key risks are with respect to those projects, you have business buy-in as well. It tends to be a very effective way. Ernst & Young, I believe it was E&Y that had this, came up with the risk prioritization approach, which is, can you identify the 2 to 3 key risks facing your organization? And you can think about that both from a project point of view. You're going to get inundated if you try to mitigate everything in the world. It's not going to happen. You don't have the resources to do it. But if you can do that from a project-based point of view, or if your approach is more holistic, expert-based risk assessment, fine. What are the two or three key risks that you're focusing on? How do you mitigate them? How do you measure them? I find the volume or quantity of risks is not always a very good metric of how effective the program is.
Thank you. I just have one question for you, Nick, because I look at your business and your enterprise, and I'm thinking, my goodness, you must have to stay close to maritime law, international law, U.S. law. How do you manage all of that, and what's the overarching tenet, if you will, that you follow with all of those type of concerns?
Yeah, and to be fair, I think every industry has this issue. If you go across any multinational, they're going to have complex legislation to work with. Certainly, I think compliance has a very has a more prominent role. Ethics and integrity has a more prominent role when the laws aren't always clear. And it gives, I think, the comfort and a proper risk assessment to the business to know that you're complying with your code and your values. So I'm not answering your question directly, but you certainly need to have communication with the business. And I think when you're dealing with regulatory environments that are constantly changing, and I think that really does apply to every multinational, whether it's the cyber or the antitrust or the I think there's certain baselines, anti-corruption, so forth. Those are standard baselines. But I think that's why I go back to my first comment. I think if you're in compliance, you're in a unique position to look at the whole picture and advise the business on various issues.
Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you to our panel, everyone.